History buffs have read it. What is one of the most fascinating stories you've learned that no one seems to talk about and can't be found in textbooks? When Ivan III of Russia married Zoe/Sophia Palaiologina, niece of Dragosis Palaiologos or Constantine XI, her uncle gifted them a library along with many other treasures. This library somehow survived the burning of Moscow in 1493 and continued to be passed down to her son, Vasily III, and then on to her grandson, Ivan IV. During Ivan IV's reign of terror, the second half of his reign, he feared the library was too precious a treasure and worried it would be stolen. So he and a few men took the collection out of Moscow, what was most likely a 1 to 3 day horse ride, and buried the books, possibly in a vault. To ensure the location of the library would never get out, he had the men killed. Ivan IV died before the location of the library was ever revealed. We have no idea what could have been in this library or if the contents have even survived. Though some historians have speculated that Plato's Hermocrates, the final dialogue pertaining to Atlantis, could have been part of the collection, there's no proof that this is true. Battle of Castleto, where Americans, Germans, Austrians, and French prisoners fought together against the Nazis. Operation Unthinkable, which was a plan by Allied command to launch an Allied attack aided by American, British, Polish, and rearmed German soldiers on the Soviets should they turn out to be untrustworthy. Stanislav Petrov is the guy who stopped a nuclear war from happening based on the belief that the other side wouldn't fire only one nuclear missile. Mulberry Harbors. The Allies knew they probably weren't going to be able to capture a harbor early on during D-Day/Overlord and needed a way to move supplies inland. Their solution was to build a harbor and drag it onto the beaches. Juan Puyol Garcia, aka the guy who American and British intelligence didn't want, so he joined German intelligence in order to convince the Allies to bring him on board. He only made up stories of his spying within the Allied ranks to feed the Germans false information about the war. Bamboozled the Nazis about everything leading up to D-Day. Battle of Karansbs, or better known as that one battle where the Austrian army attacked itself and lost. Honestly, if you're interested in World War II, go pick up a book about D-Day. There's definitely a lot of stuff about the battle itself, but the amount of preparation and planning leading up to it is insane. You probably wouldn't know how steadfast Churchill was in trying to stop the whole invasion from happening. How Patton got promoted to lead a fictional army in northern Britain to fool the Nazi defenses. Or how they made specialized tanks that could float in the water to try and provide armor support on the beaches sooner. I don't remember if it was Eisenhower or Montgomery who said it, but pretty much everything in the plans was to ensure Allied soldiers had as high of a chance as possible of surviving. The Lake Paynear disaster. Until 1980, Lake Paynear was a smallish freshwater lake with a maximum depth of about 10 to 15 feet, located in southern Louisiana. Locals mostly used it for trout fishing, and it also had a canal running 10 miles from the lake southward to the Gulf of Mexico. The main industry of the area was a massive salt mine that stood below the ground, partially underneath the lake itself. Thing is, huge natural salt deposits like this often coincide with oil reserves, so it wasn't out of the ordinary when oil companies came searching. In November of 1980, Texaco had set up a rig in the lake and was doing some exploratory drilling, hoping to make bank. Little did they know that one of their triangulation coordinates was slightly off, and so they had incorrectly guessed the location of the salt mine below their feet. Their drill bit punched into the roof of the salt deposit about 400 feet earlier than expected, and water began to drain slowly into the salt. And what happens when salt meets water? It dissolves. As the water dissolved more and more salt, it made more and more room for water to be sucked down, which in turn dissolved more salt and made more room, setting off a massive chain reaction. The oil rig on the surface keeled to the side and collapsed, its workers barely escaping before the water pressure became too much to swim through. The remnants of the rig were sucked into the bottom of the lake in what had turned from a tiny hole to a whirlpool, the force of the water shearing away soil and making a bigger hole as it went. The salt mine at the time was fully staffed with workers 1,500 feet below the ground, who were going about their daily shifts in the mine without any knowledge of the events taking place above them. Until they saw water dripping through the roof of the tunnels. Thanks to well-rehearsed evacuation plans, none of them died before the mine was flooded, but water is just about the worst thing you can see in a salt mine. The whirlpool on the surface, having eaten the rig, began to suck down the entire contents of the lake itself, including 11 barges, various small boats, and yes, the poor route. The whirlpool grew into a maelstrom, its pressure increasing and in turn building more pressure by creating a bigger and bigger hole, eroding more and more of the salt mine. As it pulled down the entire lake, the water began to shear away at the shores, creating landslides and tearing trees out by the roots. Many of Jefferson Island's 100-year-old pecan trees were lost to the Maelstrom, along with several local homes that sat on the shore of the lake and were ripped out by the foundation. The local botanical gardens was destroyed entirely as the soil underneath it was eroded in the span of only a few hours. Compressed air inside the mine finally exploded out through the mine shafts, quickly followed by a 400-foot geyser erupting from the mine's entrance. Not only did Lake Payner drain entirely into the mine, dragging 64 acres of destroyed land with it, but the pressure was so great that it also reversed the direction of the Delcamp Canal. The ocean water from the Gulf of Mexico rushed northward through the canal to fill the Payner Basin, temporarily creating the largest waterfall in Louisiana. The chaos didn't end until the pressure equalized about a week later. When things had finally calmed down, the lake had changed drastically. Its maximum depth was now about 200 feet, as opposed to its previous 10. Its shoreline had expanded, chimneys sticking straight out of the water where houses had once been. 9 out of the 11 barges claimed by the Maelstrom floated back to the surface, although 2 remained somewhere in the ground below. The botanical gardens were gone, and many of the local trees. The salt mine was temporarily shut down, and although it did reopen, it was finally closed permanently in 1986. Texaco had to pay $32 million to the salt company, and a further $13 million to the gardens. Miraculously, the only casualties of the disaster were the trout. The most important difference, however, is that today Lake Payner is now a saltwater lake with ocean species, 10 miles away from the ocean itself. All caused by some bad numbers and a 14-inch drill bit. I recently finished Killers of the Flower Moon, which was a piece of interesting history about the systematic murders of the Osage Indians around the 1920s in Oklahoma. Without going into every little detail, the Osage Indians were given head rights over land that contained oil. They were essentially given royalties for miners to come and mine for oil. It actually ended up making them the wealthiest people per capita at the time. Of course, some white folk weren't too impressed and then started systematically murdering them so that the head rights would be passed on to a relative whom happened to have a white husband, as he would be allowed to legally take possession of the head rights. It was investigated many times with nothing turned up until Hoover decided to take a much bigger vested interest in the case and assign a team to handle it. It was a pretty important case as it gave Hoover the impetus to increase the size of his department and implement new ideas as a framework moving forward for the future Department of FBI. I think it was called DOJ at the time. Anyways, I hadn't heard about this and never knew just how much these people went through at the hand of common white folk around them at the time. Very interesting read and highly recommend it. Voyageurs who worked for fur trade companies lived gross lives. Since they spent most of their time in a canoe with limited supplies, they made do with what they had. Gross stuff below. They were often missing teeth, so when they drank tea they would shove a chunk of maple sugar in their teeth gaps and drink tea through it. When the tea was done they would remove the sugar chunk, wrap it up and save it for later. The #1 cause of death for a voyageur was complications of hernia because they carried heavy cargo on their backs. The average sack was 90 pounds and they would make a contest out of who could carry the most. Often 3 and for the show-offs 4 packs. That's 360 pounds of cargo, so of course guts would herniate. They would tie their sashes as tight as possible around their stomach to keep all their internal organs in place. Since they tried to keep limited supplies so they could carry the most cargo, they would often use their toques as bowls. They would wax the yarn to waterproof the hats. So they would eat out of their hat that had hair, sweat, skin and probably bugs in it. They didn't pull over to the shore to go to the bathroom. When you had to go, you would go over the side of the canoe. This applies for both #1s and #2s. So if you had to shit, you were shitting in front of the rest of your crew. Their hygiene was awful. They often would not bathe or clean themselves up as it protected their skin from bugs and the sun. When they got close to a rendezvous point they would somewhat attempt to shave and clean themselves up. They made do with what they had, but learning about them has made me appreciate modern amenities like showers, toilets, access to health and dental care. Edit, here's some quick fun Voyageur facts. They paddled about 50 strokes per minute and the person who could carry a tune and played the fiddle were paid the best. They used music to keep pace and move faster. In Canada there were 2 main fur trade companies, Hudson Bay Company and Northwest Company. Those two companies hated each other and would get in fights all the time. Turf wars were a real thing. They were often under 5'7" because having tall people in the canoe made it difficult, and it was harder work for tall people because it took more effort to swing the paddle down. And lastly, this song was their jam. It's about when they die they want to be buried with all the wine and their head under a tap. Gross party animals to the end. The Battle for Schlossiter. If anyone told you that tankers from the 12th Armored Division of the United States fought alongside German Wehrmacht soldiers led by an SS Hauptsturmführer as well as French POWs to defend a castle, with a famous tennis player of the time, two former prime ministers of France and Charles de Gaulle's sister, against an attacking force of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, you'd have called bullshit upon bullshit, upon bullshit. But that is exactly what happened. In a small castle near Ritter in Austria, the high-profile prisoners were segregated in the latter part of the war. In May, a prisoner escaped with a letter to Allied forces, detailing the names and location of the high-value imprisoned French citizens. The first Allied unit he encountered was unable to effect a rescue, but started toward the prison before retreating back behind Allied lines. During this time, the head of the prison died under mysterious circumstances, and the second-in-command deserted, along with the host of SS guards. The prisoners, meanwhile, had taken over the prison and commandeered the arms left behind. In the nearby town, Wehrmacht troops, sick of the war and the Nazis, had deserted and formed a resistance unit that protected the citizens from Nazi hardline loyalists and SS retaliation. Major Joseph Sepp Gangl approached a unit of the 12th Armored under a flag of truce and requested aid. Captain John Lee agreed immediately, positioning his tanks in the city square as a show of force. Advised of the tenuous situation in the former prison, Lee set off with a number of tanks, but was unable to cross a small rickety bridge leading to Castleto with all his forces. He proceeded with his tank, the Bissot and Jenny, two squads of riflemen, Major Gangl, and a truck with a 10-man Wehrmacht cannon cocker crew. On the way, they encountered a group of SS troops attempting to blockade the road, who they promptly ventilated. Arriving at the castle, the captain and the major were greeted by the unlikely sight of French prisoners working side by side with Hauptsturmführer Kurt Siegfried Schrader to shore up the castle defenses. The motley crew was not best pleased with the rescue force, that didn't even quite make up a full platoon, but were happy to see any reinforcement. Lee staged his tank at the castle entrance, and the POWs, the Wehrmacht, and the 12th Armored crew deployed around the castle in a defensive perimeter. The shit was on. The next morning, a Waffen-SS group numbering over 100 launched their assault. One of the opening salvos destroying the tank that had been the heavy weapon support for the Castleto defenders. The attack continued in waves, with probing during the night to find weakness in the defenders' lines. Even after being ordered by Captain Lee to seek shelter in the castle, the French POWs stayed on the front, pouring a heavy volume of fire at the attacking SS troops. Morning after pillbox, the following day opened bleakly, with sporadic gunfire continuing throughout the night, as well as repeated grenade blasts and 88mm cannon fire. The defenders were running low on ammo. Somehow, the telephone lines back to the nearby town had not been destroyed, and comms remained intact for the duration of the battle. Lee and Gangl called back for the reinforcements, and they arrived in the afternoon to stomp a mudhole in SS ass. The strangest battle of an insane war came to a close. It was 5 days after the Führer died from self-inflicted high-velocity lead poisoning, and 2 days before the official surrender of Germany.
Definitely elevating for the 966. The ill suicidal liable to take titles and make vital signs, but not like no cancer. Answer, there's no chance to advance to ya. Kuya got blazed through ya. The great super science, applying pressure, I desecrate with double O's and bubble folds while I cut you, bro. I juggle flows that goes ballistic, reminiscent of exquisite cannibalistics and a sadistic doctor. My